القواعد الأربع. الشيخ محمد ibn ʿAbdulWahhab clarifies some of the basics of Aqidah.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا وسيئات أعمالنا. من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له، وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له، وأشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله. أما بعد. So in the previous couple of sessions in this book, Al-Qawa'id Al-Arba', we had a look at the introduction, and today then, after having done the introduction, we begin with Al-Qa'idah Al-Ula, the first principle. So bear in mind, this particular book has 4 very simple principles within it. And these 4 principles, they explain 4 very basic concepts of Tawheed and Shirk. So by understanding each of these 4 principles, we will have a better understanding of what Tawheed is, what the boundaries of Tawheed are, and what Shirk is, and the definitions of Shirk are. So let us have a look at principle number 1, mentioned by Shaykh Muhammad ibn ʿAbdulWahhab rahimahullah ta'ala in this book. He says, Al-Qa'idatul Ula أن تعلم أن الكفار الذين قاتلهم رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم مقرون بأن الله تعالى هو الخالق المدبر، وأن ذلك لم يدخلهم في الإسلام. He says the first principle that you should know, the kuffar whom the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam fought against, they acknowledged that Allah is the creator and the disposer of affairs. However, that acknowledgement alone did not enter them into Islam. Just because they acknowledged that Allah is the creator and Allah is the disposer of the affairs, that did not deem them to now have entered Islam. They were still outside of the fold of Islam, even though they acknowledged Allah is the creator and they acknowledged that Allah is the disposer of all affairs, yet they did not enter into Islam with that acknowledgement. That isn't enough. And Allah mentions in the Qur'an, the evidence for this matter is the statement of Allah in the Qur'an, قُلْ مَنْ يَرْزُقُكُمْ مِنَ السَّمَاءِ وَالْأَرْضِ أَمَّنْ يَمْلِكُ السَّمْعَ وَالْأَبْصَارَ وَمَنْ يُخْرِجُ الْحَيَّ مِنَ الْمَيِّتِ وَيُخْرِجُ الْمَيِّتَ مِنَ الْحَيِّ وَمَنْ يُدَبِّرُ الْأَمْرَ فَسَيَقُولُونَ اللَّهُ فَقُلْ أَفَلَا تَتَّقُونَ. Say, who provides for you from the sky and from the earth, or who owns hearing and sight, and who brings out the living from the dead and brings out the dead from the living, and who disposes the affairs? They will say, Allah. They will say, Allah. So then say to them, will you not be afraid of Allah's punishment for setting up rivals in worship alongside Him? This ayah in Surah Yunus 31 highlights very clearly that those mushrikun acknowledged certain things. If they were asked, who provides for you from the skies and the earth? They acknowledge it is Allah. If it is said to them, who controls the hearing and the sight? They will say it is Allah. They acknowledge that too. And who brings out the living from the dead and the dead from the living? They will say certainly Allah. So notice, they acknowledged all of this. And if you say to them, who is the disposer of the affairs? They will say Allah. So they acknowledged all of these affairs. They acknowledged all of these matters. And yet, it was not considered enough for them to be Muslims. They did not enter into the fold of Islam, even though they acknowledged all of these things. Shaykh al-Fawzan hafidhahullah ta'ala says, دل على أن التوحيد ليس هو الإقرار بالربوبية فقط. This indicates that the meaning of Tawheed is not just the acceptance of Ar-Rububiyyah. And we know that the meaning of Ar-Rububiyyah, Tawheed Ar-Rububiyyah, it is the affirmation that Allah is the creator, the provider, the sustainer, the one who gives life and death, the one who controls the universe and disposes of the affairs. That all of those matters, they are performed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone, and there is no one else who participates or does any of those affairs. That is Tawheed al-Rububiyyah, the Lordship of Allah. But we learn here that belief in the Lordship of Allah, that by itself is not enough to be considered a Muslim. That in and of itself is not enough for someone to claim that they have now entered into Islam with that belief. That belief alone is not enough. The acknowledgement and the belief in the Rububiyyah of Allah alone is not enough. More than that is needed to enter into Islam. Because we see here that the mushrikun, they accepted Ar-Rububiyyah. They acknowledged Allah as the creator, the provider, the sustainer, the one who gives life and death. They acknowledged all of that. Yet they were not Muslims, and they had not entered into the fold of Islam with this acknowledgement. So we learn very clearly, as Shaykh al-Fawzan mentions, acknowledging the Rububiyyah of Allah, that alone is not sufficient for a person to be deemed a Muslim, for a person to be considered as having entered into Islam. It is not enough. ومع ذلك إقرارهم بتوحيد الربوبية لم يدخلهم في الإسلام. So the mushrikun, their acknowledgement of الربوبية did not enter them into Islam. ولم يحرم دماءهم ولا أموالهم, and it did not make their blood and their wealth haram. فدل على أن التوحيد ليس هو الإقرار بالربوبية فقط. So this indicates that acknowledgement of Ar-Rububiyyah, that is not the meaning of Tawheed alone. وأن الشرك ليس هو الشرك في الربوبية فقط. And therefore, shirk is not only deemed as shirk in Ar-Rububiyyah. So Tawheed and shirk is not restricted to the topic of Ar-Rububiyyah. This is important because there are many people out there claiming to be from the learned and from the knowledgeable, And when you ask them regarding the Tawheed of Allah, their full explanation is centered around Rubiyah. And that is incorrect. Tawheed is not exclusive and restricted to Rubiyah. Shirk is not restricted to the affair of Rubiyah. But when you ask many of them now, they will say to you, Tawheed is to believe Allah is the creator and Allah is the provider and Allah is the one who gives life and death. Yes, that is part of the belief of Tawheed. But that is not all of it. But for some of the misguided ones and the uneducated ones, for them, when you ask them about Tawheed, they think that the issue of Rubiyah, that's all of Tawheed. Believe Allah's the creator, the provider, the sustainer, the one who gives life and death, the one who disposes of the affairs. You are upon Tawheed if you believe all of that. And the reality is, that is only a portion of the Tawheed. And it is far greater than just that. Because just that part, even the mushrikun acknowledged and believed and accepted that part. And they weren't considered Muslims, even though they acknowledged that part. So this indicates to us that Tawheed is not restricted to the issue of Rububiyah alone. It's greater than that. بل ليس هناك أحد أشرك في الربوبية إلا شواذ من الخلق. The Shaykh goes on to say that in reality, there are very few people who commit shirk in the aspect of Rububiyah. Meaning that's not even the issue. Throughout history, the mushrikun, from the different times of the different prophets and messengers, their dispute with their prophets and messengers was not regarding the Rububiyah. The various prophets and messengers that came throughout history, the dispute their people had with them was not that the people refused to believe Allah is the creator. It was not that the people refused to believe Allah is the one who disposes of the affairs, or that Allah is the one who gives life and death, or that Allah is the one who controls. No. Their dispute with their prophets and messengers was not about that. They acknowledged that. Their dispute with the prophets and messengers was something greater or further on from that. And that was the issue of al-uluhiyyah. Singling out Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala with worship. Because it's one thing, somebody saying that they believe Allah's the creator, the provider, the sustainer, the one who disposes of the affairs, but then continuing to worship others besides Allah alongside Allah. And this is why Allah mentioned the Rububiyah so often in the Qur'an. You may think, why would the Rububiyah, the issue of Allah's Lordship, be mentioned in the Qur'an so often? Why? When the kuffar and the mushrikun, they acknowledged it, and their dispute with their prophets and with the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam wasn't about the Rububiyah, wasn't about the Lordship. So then why is the Rububiyah mentioned in the Qur'an so often then? And that is because of the relationship between al-Rububiyah and al-Uluhiyyah. The relationship between al-Rububiyah and al-Uluhiyyah. Al-Rububiyah tastalzim al-Uluhiyyah. The Tawheed of al-Rububiyah, of the Lordship of Allah, necessitates from you the belief in the Tawheed of al-Uluhiyyah, meaning singling out Allah with your worship then. Why? Because if you believe Allah is the only provider, Allah is the only sustainer, Allah is the only one who gives life and death, Allah is the only one who disposes of the affairs, Allah is the only one who controls the heavens and the earth and the universe, and all of these other actions that are specific to Allah, you believe only Allah is attributed with all of those actions, specifically Him alone, nobody else. That then necessitates from you that you should be worshipping only Allah in that case. How can you say that you acknowledge only Allah is the creator, the provider, the sustainer, the disposer of affairs, etc., but then go and worship something else besides Allah who you know is not the creator, not the provider, not the sustainer, not the disposer of affairs? How can that be? Makes no sense. How can you acknowledge the Rubiyah to Allah alone and then worship others that you know do not have Rubiyah? That is a refutation of yourself. It is a contradiction upon yourself. And that's why the relationship between Rububiyah and Uluhiyah is that Rububiyah necessitates Al-Uluhiyah. You acknowledge the Rububiyah of Allah, it necessitates from you to be worshipping Allah alone in that case. If you don't, then it's as though you are contradicting yourself and you are refuting yourself. Because on the one hand, you are saying only Allah is the provider, sustainer, creator. But then on the other hand, you are worshipping others that you know are not providers and creators and sustainers. So then why are you worshipping them? Why are you not singling out your worship to Allah alone, even though you are acknowledging Allah alone is the one with Rububiyah? That's why in the Qur'an, Allah mentions the Rububiyah so often, because it serves as being an establishment of the evidence upon the mushrikun. It is like saying to them in the Qur'an that you mushrikun, you believe in this Rububiyah of Allah, and it's mentioned in the Qur'an in many places to establish, look, you mushrikun, you believe in this Rububiyah, and yet you are not singling out Allah in Al-Uluhiyah. Contradiction upon yourselves, misguidance that you are upon, kufr that you are upon. You acknowledge the Rububiyah of Allah, yet you do not single Him out in worship. How can that be? So this is a rebuke of them via the mentioning of a Rububiyah. That's why it's mentioned in the Qur'an so often. Because a person may say otherwise, if they believed in the Rububiyah of Allah anyway, then why mention it in the Qur'an so often? Why not just talk about Uluhiyah where they had their dispute? Because the Rububiyah necessitates the Uluhiyah. So by mentioning it in the Qur'an often, it is establishing the evidence upon them that you mushrikun believe in all of this Rububiyah, and yet you're still not singling out Allah in worship. It is establishing the evidence upon them. So that's what's being mentioned here briefly. That just acknowledging the Rububiyah of Allah, it does not enter you into Islam. It requires the acknowledgement and the belief in the Rububiyah of Allah, and also the other aspects of Tawheed, Al-Uluhiyya, Al-Asma' wa Sifat. And that's why Shaykh Al-Fawzan, he highlights here that their acknowledgement of the Rububiyah of Allah, it does not enter them into Islam. If a person says, yes, they believe Allah's the creator, Allah's the provider, Allah's the sustainer, Allah's the one who controls the affairs, they believe in all of that, yet they carry on going and committing shirk and worshipping others besides Allah, then are they Muslim? No. even though they've acknowledged the Rububiyah of Allah, they are not acknowledging the Uluhiyah of Allah. They are not singling out Allah in worship, even though they acknowledge Allah is the only provider, creator, sustainer. And that's the point. The mushrikun at the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they acknowledged the Rububiyah of Allah. That wasn't their dispute. But they did not follow that through with that which it necessitates by then implementing the Uluhiyah and singling out Allah in worship. Rather, they acknowledged the Rububiyah and continued still upon their shirk in al-Uluhiyah, in associating others alongside Allah, worshipping others, calling upon others. And that's why their acknowledgement of a Rububiyah alone, without the Uluhiyah, without the other aspects of Tawheed, it did not therefore enter them into Islam. Acknowledgement of Rububiyah alone does not enter you into Islam. And so, like we were mentioning before, there are many people these days, many groups out there, and you will have them, these types of people who give you these other explanations in Trinidad, in Tobago. You will find many of them. When you ask them what is Tawheed, their full explanation basically just goes around a Rububiyah. That's it. And that is a deficient explanation. That is not Tawheed by itself. To believe Allah is the creator, the provider, the sustainer, that is only one aspect of the Tawheed. The other aspects are to single out Allah alone, but they know themselves they have issues when it comes to that section. That they believe in all types of intercession with the dead and the shafa'ah and all types of affairs. And so when you ask them about Tawheed, they try to keep it restricted just around the Rububiyah. Tawheed is to believe Allah is the only creator. Allah is the only provider. Allah is the only one who gives life and death. All of it which is true. But it's only a portion of the overall answer. They neglect the rest of the aspects of Tawheed, the critical aspects of Tawheed. So here, the Shaykh highlights that the mushrikun at the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, they acknowledged al-Rububiyyah. Al-Shaykh al-Fawzan says, فَلَا أَحَدَ مِنَ الْخَلْقِ ادَّعَى أَنَّ هُنَاكَ أَحَدًا يَخْلُقُ مَعَ اللَّهِ تَعَالَى. He says it's a rare thing for there to be those who claim throughout history that there are other creators besides Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, أو يرزق مع الله, or that there are others who provide and sustain besides Allah, أو يحيي ويميت, or that they give life and death besides Allah. That's not where the issue was. بل المشركون مقرون بأن الله هو الخالق الرازق المحيي المميت المدبر. The mushrikun, they believed and they acknowledged Allah is the creator, the provider, the one who gives life and death. In the Qur'an, in Surah Luqman, ayah number 25, وَلَئِن سَأَلْتَهُمْ مَنْ خَلَقَ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضَ لَيَقُولُنَّ اللَّهِ. That if you were to ask them, who created the heavens and the earth, they would say, surely it is Allah. They would acknowledge, surely it is Allah. The mushrikun would acknowledge that. And in the Quran also, Al-Mu'minun 86-87, قُلْ مَنْ رَبُّ السَّمَاوَاتِ السَّبْعِ وَرَبُّ الْعَرْشِ الْعَظِيمِ سَيَقُولُونَ لِلَّهِ. That who is the Lord of the seven heavens and the great throne? Who is the Lord of the seven heavens and the great throne? سَيَقُولُونَ لِلَّهِ. They will say, it belongs to Allah. The mushrikun would acknowledge that, and they would say that it belongs to Allah. And the Shaykh says, another evidence in Yunus, the one that was quoted earlier, قُلْ مَنْ يَرْزُقُكُمْ مِنَ السَّمَاءِ وَالْأَرْضِ أَمَّنْ يَمْلِكُ السَّمْعَ وَالْأَبْصَارَ Who is it that provides for you from the heavens and the earth? And who is it that controls the hearing and the seeing? وَمَنْ يُخْرِجُ الْحَيَّ مِنَ الْمَيِّتِ وَالْمَيِّتَ مِنَ الْحَيِّ. And who is the وَيُخْرِجُ الْمَيِّتَ مِنَ الْحَيِّ. And who is the one that brings out the living from the dead and brings out the dead from the living? وَمَنْ يُدَبِّرُ الْأَمْرِ. And who is the one who disposes of the affair, controls the affair? فَسَيَقُولُونَ. Then they will say, Allah. And that's in the Qur'an. That the mushrikun, the kuffar, they would acknowledge all of this. So bear in mind, the dispute wasn't that the mushrikun refused to believe in Allah and believe that Allah is the creator and the provider and the sustainer and the one who gives life and death. That wasn't the dispute. They believed that, they acknowledged it. The dispute was after that, what it necessitates, that you must therefore worship Allah alone. And that's what they would not do. They wanted to believe in all of that, acknowledge all of that, but also keep a hold of their other deities too, even though they knew they do not have a Rubiyah. They couldn't let go. They wanted to keep the attachment to these others besides Allah too. And that's where the issue was. That's where they were committing their shirk. So be aware, because it is something which is very important for our time today. And as Shaykh Al-Fawzan himself mentions it, he says that there are people today who attempt to restrict all of this to just Ar-Rububiyyah, and that is not the correct understanding of Tawheed. It is greater than that, and it is broader than that. And the key thing to remember there as well is the connection between Ar-Rububiyyah and Al-Uluhiyyah. That if a person acknowledges the Rububiyyah, the Lordship of Allah, it then necessitates from you to accept Al-Uluhiyyah. You believe Allah is the sole provider, creator, sustainer, etc. Therefore, you should only worship Him. Ar-Rububiyyah necessitates Al-Uluhiyyah. And when you think of it the other way around, what is the relationship of Al-Uluhiyyah back towards Ar-Rububiyyah that way? Then it is At-Tadammun. Al-Uluhiyyah incorporates Ar-Rububiyyah. Imagine now somebody says, yes, I acknowledge Al-Uluhiyyah. What does that mean? If a person acknowledges the worship of Allah alone, acknowledges all forms of worship are sincerely and purely to Allah alone, Al-Uluhiyyah generally, acknowledges all of that, then that means it incorporates his Ar-Rububiyyah. How so? Because if a person acknowledges he must only worship Allah alone, how has he come to that acknowledgement? Via having acknowledged that Allah is the one with the Rububiyyah alone. A person has come to the acknowledgement of Al-Uluhiyyah because he's acknowledged Ar-Rububiyyah. So they say, the scholars mention, if you're thinking about the relationship of Al-Uluhiyyah back towards Ar-Rububiyyah, then Al-Uluhiyyah incorporates Ar-Rububiyyah. You have arrived at Al-Uluhiyyah because of your acceptance already of Ar-Rububiyyah. So Al-Uluhiyyah incorporates Ar-Rububiyyah. Whereas if you're at Ar-Rububiyyah right now, then what is the relationship going towards Al-Uluhiyyah? That this acknowledgement of Ar-Rububiyyah should necessitate. It's a relationship of necessitating. It necessitates that you should then believe in Al-Uluhiyyah. So that is the explanation of the relationship between them. In Arabic they say, Ar-Rububiyyah تستلزم الألوهية والألوهية تتضمن الربوبية. So that is the very first principle, and that is all the Shaykh highlights. It's a small book, and he's highlighting very short, sharp points. And so the first clear point being highlighted is Tawheed is not just a Rubiyah. Shirk is not just a Rubiyah. You do not enter into Islam just with a Rubiyah. It's not just about you saying, I believe in Allah, Allah is the creator, the provider, the one who gives life and death, and you're Muslim. It isn't like that. That is only one aspect of it. It then continues with the other aspects of singling out your worship to Allah alone in all of your worship, from the heart, from the tongue, from the limbs, upon sincerity, everything directed to Allah alone, the sincerity and purity of worship to Allah. So it is not just restricted to a Rububiyah. Even the mushrikun believed and accepted the Rububiyah, but they were not deemed as Muslims. So do not allow the people to confuse you these days. When you ask them of their understanding of Tawheed, they say Tawheed is to believe Allah is the one provider, one creator, one Lord. That's all true, but that is only a part of the answer. Tell them, give us the rest of the answer. What about al-uluhiyya, al-asma'u was-sifat, singling out Allah in worship? Why do you go to the graves then? Why do you call upon the dead? This is all a part of Tawheed. Do not stop your answer just at the Rububiyah. So that is the first principle being mentioned here in Al-Qawā'id Al-Arba'. That is all that is mentioned, that clear point. Next time we'll begin with principle number 2, and that goes on to explaining a little bit more detail as to why the mushrikun were not Muslim. Even though they acknowledged point number 1. They acknowledged this first principle, but they weren't Muslims because they had errors in their uluhiyya. And that's what we'll then go on to in more detail from the next session in the second principle from Al-Qawā'id Al-Arba', insha'Allah ta'ala. So we'll conclude upon that for today then. وصلى الله على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم.